people gone out of town. So we, Myrtle, are the poor people who can't go out of town. Okay. We got stuck in Durban, but it's nice to see Myrtle again. It's nice to see Lisa with us. First time after your baptism. Absolutely fantastic to have Lisa Standish with us. Man, it's so good being together. Hey, Michiel, I really appreciate what you had to say this morning. I don't know if you know, but we've got a few anti-vaxxers in the church. And anyway, next week we're having a special baptism service for them. I'm going to be holding them under for 5 minutes at a time. Anyway, hey, we love you anti-vaxxers as well. But anyway, I just might say some horrible things at your funeral service. But anyway, let's get on. Folks, if you haven't been with us last week, we've started a series working through Hebrews chapter 11, the faith hall of fame. We looked at Moses last week, but we can see in Hebrews chapter 11 what God can do when men and women walk, act, and live by faith. I tell you, I just really enjoyed just preparing these last two lessons. It just reminded me how outstanding these people were, men and women who are listed there in Hebrews chapter 11. And you see, it's not just about them. It's about us, because this was written in the New Testament for New Testament believers, and that's us. We are New Testament believers, and the Hebrew writer is saying, learn from them. Learn from Moses. Learn from Sarah. Learn from Abraham and Rahab and the others, and we're going to be look at some of them. So my hope is that we're going to be transformed when we learn what it means to be kingdom heroes who are living by faith. I want to suggest to you this morning that when God is ready to give you and move you up to a new level of experience with Him, it seems that He gives you a test. He gives you an exam. And the bad news is, it is a test. It is a test. And the good news about a test is that it prepares you for a higher level. We've got Melissa's son Enzo is busy writing his matric exams right now, and I always loved, how did it go? How did the test go today? Well, you know what? This is your matric. It's there in terms of schooling. It's the highest level you can go to, but it's not there to prepare you for school. It's there to prepare you for a higher level of education. And we seem to see these tests that God gives people in New Testament. Don't we read that the testing of your faith is there to produce steadfastness? You know, you wouldn't know how fit you are until you did a fitness test. And so these tests are there to say, hey, you're okay. You can now move on to the next challenge, the bigger race, the more difficult one. And you can really know if God is ready to move you to another level, because it will be a final exam. It will be a major test. Perhaps there'll be a few pop quizzes around the way, but you know, with the final exams, sometimes seems that it will knock you over. It will take you out. But then again, it is a major exam preparing you for a major level. Today we're going to look at a man. God gave him a final exam. It was a hectic exam. We're going to talk about Abraham. And the Bible tells us that God asked Abraham to offer up his son Isaac. And what we read about in Hebrews chapter 11 is, of course, coming from Genesis chapter 22, those first verses. And Andre very capably read some of that for us this morning. So Abraham is told to offer up Isaac, who was the son of promise. Remember him and his wonderful wife Sarah couldn't have a child, a child. And then along came Ishmael, that's another story. And then finally, the child of promise in their old age. And God says, I want you to offer your son. Abraham knew that this is a major test. This is not a pop quiz. When God asks you to do something so incredible like this, and looking back, we can see it was a final exam because God was going to do some extraordinary things with Abraham after that. And that's for another lesson. He was testing Abraham. Abraham passed the test. Man, he went and God would bless all the nations of the earth because of his faith. You know, it was a major exam because God was asking Abraham to do something so significant in his life and something that absolutely made no sense. You're a loving God. You finally give me a son, and now you want me to sacrifice him. Genesis chapter 22. I'm reading the first two verses. God tells Abraham, gives these words. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. You ever feel like God's putting you through a test? Maybe it's a financial test, maybe it's a health issue, maybe it's a relationship thing. God puts us through tests. God tested Abraham and he said to him, Abraham, here am I, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, and Abraham's going, Ishmael? Okay, we'll park that one side for a while. Your son who you love? Yes, Isaac. Your son who you love, Isaac. And go to the region of Moriah. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. In other words, you go late and I'll fill in the details a little bit longer. Church, how do you worship God when God asks you to do something that makes absolutely no sense? How do you worship God? How do you go to the altar when you believe that God is messing with you? He's tricked you. He's failed you. How do I go to church today, especially when you're asking me, command me to do something so radical? It goes against every single fiber of my being. I think that's what Abraham is thinking. God said to Abraham, get up and go to the place I will show you. Abraham had to obey without knowing the details. Folks, that's what faith is. Faith is obeying when you don't know all the details. And that's for us in so many ways. We don't know what's happening with the future. We don't know what's going to happen with all this COVID thing. Just thank God that the numbers are coming down. God was saying, I will show you the details when I see you moving. And one of the reasons I think sometimes we don't always see the details because we haven't moved an inch. Hey, God, show us and then we will move. Now God said, now you move and then I will show you the details. God's calling us to move it because you see, faith is measured by movement. If there is no movement, if there's no progression, there is no faith, irrespective of how faith-ish, how Christian-ish you might feel. So Abraham got up. Genesis chapter 22 and verse 4, on the third day, Abraham looked up. He looked up and he saw the place in the distance. So he was traveling and he wasn't sure. God said, I will show you when you get there. And he looked up and then he saw where he was going. And I want to remind you, Abraham is traveling with an entourage. It's not just him and Isaac. So let's keep going here. Chapter 2 and verse 25. Chapter 22 of Genesis, verse 5. This verse will mess with your head. Okay? He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Hang on, God has just told you you're going to sacrifice your son there. We will come back to you. In other words, when Isaac and I have finished with our church service, over there, we're going to go worship, we're going to come back to you. Folks, hang on a second. God told him to sacrifice Isaac, and I think the scriptures indicate that he clearly intended to do that. But he's just told his servants that when he has finished, he and the boy are coming back. And so this is kind of the dilemma here. So when you're called to faith, you have to speak the truth in the midst of this contradiction of the circumstances. And so I ask you this morning, why did Abraham say, we will be back? What made Abraham believe that he and Isaac will come back? Well, it's very easy. So if you know the story, you're second guessing me here, because we're going to go to the book of Hebrews chapter 11, and it says the reason he said that he and Isaac will be back is because he believed God can raise the dead. So let's read Hebrews chapter 11 verse 19 together. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Wow, that's hectic. So look what's happening here. Abraham's faith was so strong that he would believe that he would go, that he would build this fire, he would build this altar, he would sacrifice Isaac there, but that after that, God would raise Isaac back from the dead, and he would return with Isaac back to his servants and the donkey. Abraham so believed that Isaac was the child of promise, and he so believed that God still had amazing things planned for his future. So strong was Abraham's faith that he believed God would miraculously bring Isaac back from the dead. So where did Abraham get this idea that God could raise the dead from? Well, I think there was a lot of pop quizzes in his past that you might remember that said, God's come through for me then, and then, and then. You might remember that he was married to an old lady by the name of Sarah, and her womb was kaputski. It was not in childbearing mode anymore. Even really in her history, she couldn't have children. And of course, God brought that womb back to life again. Can I remind you, at the age, Abraham's age, when he had Isaac, how old was he? 100 years old. 100 years old. Here's a really old man and a really old lady with a barren womb. God organizes a hookup, and a child is born. God, if you can do that, you can bring Isaac back from the dead. Don't forget that we come through, God comes through for us so many times in this life. We have to look back in the past and see he'll come through for us in the morning. So they moved to the place where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac. I'm reading from Genesis chapter 22 and verse 7. Isaac spoke up and he said to his father Abraham, "Hey, Dad? Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" "Hey, Dad, every time we go to church, you got the lamb under your arm, you've organized everything. Are you getting a little old? Have you forgotten? For a sacrifice, we need a lamb." And Abraham replies to his son Isaac. He basically said, "Don't worry, God has got this one." Genesis chapter 22 and verse 8, Abraham answered God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. There's Isaac. Okay. If you say God will provide, God will provide. In other words, only God, folks, has the answer to this dilemma. Sometimes there's dilemmas that we face in life. Only God has the answer to those dilemmas. And those dilemmas, they come in the way of final exams. They come in the way of major tests. both Abraham and Isaac, God's going to take care of this final exam scenario. This is a final exam, and I'm trusting God to come through with a solution because I don't have the answers, but God has. So we go back now from Hebrews. Let's go to Genesis chapter 22 and verse 9. This is, Andre read up to verse 8 this morning. When they had reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Folks, I can't get my mind around there. Isaac is clearly not a baby. And Abraham is clearly not a young man. But somehow, okay, Dad, he bound him up, put him on the altar. Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham! Here am I, he replied. You know, the first time God called Abraham, he only used his name once. But now he shouts out from heaven and he uses his name twice. Abraham, Abraham. You've got to know something special is coming here. Do not lay a hand on the boy, verse 12, he said. Do not do anything to him. And now this passage, this is going to blow your mind. Now I know that you fear God. Now, folks, that creates a theological problem. Because doesn't God know everything? Doesn't God know yesterday, today, and tomorrow? Doesn't all the Bible say God is omniscient? He knows everything. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of verse 12, do not do anything to him. Now I know, as if he didn't know before. How do we work that out? So now I'm going to hand over to Michiel, who's going to come up and... But this is hectic stuff, what he's saying here. Folks, this creates a problem in my head, like a theological problem. Now I know. You know, God is omniscient. He knows everything. You already knew what Abraham would do because you are God. You know yesterday, and you know tomorrow, and today, you know everything. You know where I came from, where I'm going. You know what I'm going to eat for lunch, although I don't even know yet. What do you mean, now I know, as if you didn't know before? As if you only learned this from Abraham's actions. How do we reconcile this with an all-knowing God? Now, folks, I'm going to propose something to you, and I don't even know if I believe it myself yet, but I'm working through this. So you can maybe work through this with me. And the way I understand it is, God knows everything actual and everything potential, but God doesn't know everything experiential. For instance, if you ask God, what does it feel like to commit a sin? Well, God's never committed a sin. So how can he speak that? Okay, I'm trying to fix this thing in my mind. I'm trying to reconcile this. And the reason why God became a man in the form of Jesus Christ, according to the book of Hebrews, was so that he could sympathize with our weakness. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15 says, Jesus, and of course God in the flesh, was able to sympathize with our weakness. It says in Hebrews chapter 4, he's not like a God who doesn't understand what we went through because he was tempted like we are. You know, that's one of the reasons Jesus came to this earth, to understand, to feel what it is like to be tempted. An experiential experience. So if the Father knows what we go through, Jesus can feel it when we are tempted, when we suffer pain. He feels it. He wanted to know what the information feels like. And that is why he sent his son, because Jesus, he became a man. So I think what is happening here is God is saying, I know you love me, because now I can feel it. Because you gave me the experience of your love. It was just, I don't even have to ask Abraham to sacrifice his son. I know he'll do it. And it's something you might just want to, hey, send me an email. I would love to hear what your thoughts are. So here it is. This is not just the verbalization of it. You know, yes, God, I love you. No, God, I'm going to show you, and you will be able to get that feeling from me. You know, I can feel you chose to obey me over that which you love the most. Here's a question for your church this morning. Is there anything that God cannot have from you because you are too attached to it? Is there anything in your life, in your family, that God cannot have because you're too attached to it? This is final exam stuff. This is not a pop quiz. We go to Genesis chapter 22 and verse 13. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Verse 14, and Abraham called the place Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. So to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Folks, this is one of the great names of God. Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. And by the way, a little translation of Jireh is to see beforehand. God could see beforehand, and he will provide. So when Abraham was coming up the one side of the mountain was Isaac, boy, there was a ram coming up on the other side. And God was providing for what he had already pre-seen. Boy, you got to believe this is the quietest ram you've ever seen in your life before. You know, normally I think a ram get caught in a thicket, in a bush or something, would be screaming and thrashing around. Nothing. But all of a sudden, Abraham noticed it. You see, God's prevision never came before became Abraham's provision until Abraham had obeyed. Can I say that again? God's prevision, he could see it that he was going to provide in the future, but that never became Abraham's provision until Abraham obeyed. Whatever God is going to do in your life and your circumstances, he's pre-seen that. But it's not going to be provided until you have done what God has asked you to do. You know, the problem is so many Christians they're part-time saints. And they wonder why God is not coming through with all these provisions that he's promised. Well, because they dabble a little in Christianity. And if you delay obedience, you delay prevision becoming provision in your life. The good news is that Abraham, you know, we look at Abraham, he failed in his past, as we all do. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. No one even here today can claim that we've ever lived the most perfect, fail-free life. And God is saying, no problem. I'll be patient with you. You get up and you take on the next test, and the next test, and the next test. So God is saying, you want the provision? I want the experience of your obedience. You want the provision? God's wanting the experience of us just obeying in faith, stepping out in faith, knowing that God will come through. I'm reading in John chapter 8, and this is looking back. This is looking back to the story of Abraham. And guess who's looking back is Jesus. He's been given a hard time by the Pharisees, and we get to the conclusion of our lesson here. Jesus here is given the hard time of the Pharisees. Are you greater than our father Abraham? The Pharisees asked. He replied, greater than our father Abraham. He died, and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are? Jesus replied, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me, who gives me the glory. Though you do not know him, I know him. You Pharisee, you don't know God. He's my Father. I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar to you, but I do know him and obey his word. Now here it is, verse 56. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day, Jesus' day. He saw it and was glad. Abraham, by faith, saw Jesus' day. He saw it and he was glad. You're not 50 years old, they said, and you have seen Abraham? Very truly I say to you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was, I am. At this they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. Folks, Jesus has just told the Pharisees that Abraham saw his day, the day he would be glorified on the cross. What day did Abraham see? Well, you need to understand this. So God says, I want you to go to the region of Moriah to sacrifice Isaac. And then I'm going to show you the specific place. You know what that specific place was? It was Mount Moriah. And you know where Mount Moriah is? It's just a few hundred yards from Mount Calvary. So where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac, man, if you just look over there, that's where the ultimate Son of God would die on Calvary for our sins. John chapter 8 and verse 56, Abraham looked at Jesus' day and he smiled. Says one translation. Abraham. This is you just understand, God, you're going to take care of it. And I understand you're going to take care of the sins of the world. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, looking at Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. That's what we do. We, like Abraham, we just go about life and we obey. We can't see the outcome, but we understand, Jesus, you are the author. You are the finisher of our faith, and you have provided the greatest sacrifice ever. So today, while you are on your journey in this life, and you are tested by sometimes final exams, keep your eyes on Jesus, because he will get you out onto the mountain of your exam experience, and he will be there to help you pass the test. So when you are afraid, you look at Jesus. When you're angry, you look at Jesus. When you're tempted, when you are frustrated, you look at Jesus, and you know that you can make it because he's got it covered. And because Abraham can look at Jesus in the Old Testament, we can look at him today. Let's stand and sing together.